The Ordnance Survey map, printed in 1931, shows a road that ends at a village called Lochgarroch. The map printed in 1933 shows the same road, ending at nothing. Nobody filed an amendment. Nobody signed a correction. The village was simply gone, and the cartographers moved on as though they had never drawn it. As though the act of removing a name from a map was the same, administratively, as removing a place from the world. As though paper and reality operated on the same ledger, and someone had simply balanced the books. I want you to stay with that image for a moment. A road that leads somewhere in 1931, a road that leads nowhere in 1933. 2 years. No public record of what changed. No announcement. No inquiry. No explanation filed with any office that has ever been made available to any researcher who has gone looking. And researchers have gone looking. I know because I read their notes in the margins of the archive request forms. The frustration accumulates in pencil. Question marks that were never answered. Names circled and then crossed out when the trail went cold. I found Lochgarroch because I was looking for something else entirely. I was working through the Board of Agriculture's land settlement correspondence from the early 1920s, trying to trace the administrative aftermath of the 1919 Land Settlement Act. The legislation that was supposed to finally, after a century of clearance and displacement, return viable crofting land to returning veterans across the Scottish Highlands. It was slow work. The files are organized in ways that suggest they were organized by someone who did not want them found easily. Cross-references that lead to other cross-references. Index numbers that don't match the boxes they're supposed to. The kind of filing that looks like bureaucratic incompetence, until you notice it happens consistently, and only in certain categories, and always around the same geographical areas. That is when I started paying attention differently. The Ordnance Survey kept meticulous revision records. Every change to every map had to be justified, logged, and initiated by a supervising officer. When a road was extended, there was a form. When a parish boundary shifted, there was a form. When a building was demolished and removed from the survey, there was a form. The forms are held at the National Records of Scotland in Edinburgh, and they are, for the most part, complete and accessible. Surveyors were nothing if not thorough. The whole system depended on the record being unbroken. For Lochgarroch, there is no form. The 1931 map exists. The 1933 map exists. The revision record that should sit between them. The document explaining why a named settlement was removed from an official cartographic survey of Great Britain does not exist. It was not misfiled. It was not lost in the reorganization of 1924. It is not restricted. It is simply absent. A gap in a system specifically designed to have no gaps. I requested confirmation from the National Records of Scotland that the file was missing and not merely uncatalogued. Their response, which took 6 weeks and was entirely courteous, confirmed that no revision record for the removal of Lochgarroch from the Ross-shire survey could be located in the relevant series. They suggested it may have been lost. They used the word may with the careful precision of an institution that has learned to be careful with words. May have been lost, or may have been removed. These are not the same thing. And in my experience, when a document cannot be found in a system that was built to ensure documents could always be found, the explanation is rarely accidental. Now let me tell you about Donald Crike. Donald Crike was a postal inspector employed by the General Post Office, responsible for a rural delivery route that covered the western parishes of Rossshire from 1919 through to the autumn of 1923. His route logs are held in a collection of post office administrative records that were transferred to the Highland Archive Centre in Inverness in 1991, and they are among the most detailed documents of daily rural life in that region that survive from the period. Crike was a precise man. He logged every delivery point, every household count, every irregularity. He noted when roads became impassable. He noted when households changed hands. He noted twice when dogs presented a hazard to the postal bag. He was the kind of man who believed the record should reflect reality exactly, and he kept his record accordingly. His September 1923 entry for Lochgarroch reads as follows: 47 delivery points. Post office operational. School in session. Children observed at recess. Approximately 20. The weather is clear. Road surface adequate from the junction. All deliveries accepted. 47 households. A functioning post office. A school with children in the yard at recess. A road that was passable. This was Lochgarroch in September of 1923. A living settlement, documented by a meticulous civil servant doing his ordinary job on an ordinary morning, noting what he saw because that was what you did, because the record was supposed to reflect reality. 2 months later, Donald Crike was transferred. His transfer papers are in the same archive, filed with his personnel record. The stated reason for the transfer, typed in the standard administrative format of the period, reads, "Route consolidation, district no longer applicable." He was moved to a different region entirely. There is no complaint in his file, no appeal, no record of any correspondence about the transfer. A man who had worked the same route for 4 years was reassigned in November of 1923, and the reason given was that his district was no longer applicable. Not reorganized, not merged, not renamed. No longer applicable. I want you to understand what that phrase meant in administrative practice. A district becomes no longer applicable when it ceases to require administration, when the people and institutions within it no longer generate postal needs, when there is, in the language of civil service logistics, nothing left to deliver to. In September, 47 households, all deliveries accepted. In November, the district was no longer applicable. I spent 3 weeks trying to find what happened in the 8 weeks between those 2 data points. I found the school register that confirms what Crike saw from the road. 23 children were enrolled at Lochgarroch Parish School as of the 1st of September, 1923. Their names are in the register. Their ages. In some cases, the name of the parent or guardian who enrolled them. 23 children who were present at school on the morning Donald Crike drove past and noted them at recess. I cross-referenced those children's household names against the 1921 census for the district, which is publicly available and which I accessed through the Scotland's People database. The Tantudaistri households match. Real families, real addresses, real people captured by the machinery of the British state in 1921, enrolled in a school in 1923, And then, in every subsequent official record, every census, every parish register, every electoral roll, every administrative document generated after November of 1923, gone. Not dead, not relocated with documentation, not recorded as having moved to any receiving parish, not counted in any adjacent settlement's population increase. Simply absent from every record that follows, the way a word is absent when it has been deliberately and carefully removed from a sentence, leaving the sentence intact, leaving the punctuation in place, leaving no obvious wound, just a space where meaning used to be. Root consolidation. District no longer applicable. I want you to hold those words a little longer, because when I found the school register, the one that lists 23 children by name, enrolled in September of 1923, I understood that no longer applicable was doing an enormous amount of work for 4 syllables. Somewhere in the Ross-shire Hills, there is a road that the 1931 map says leads somewhere. The 1933 map says it leads nowhere. The road itself has never moved. There are 11 men from Lochgarroch listed on a war memorial. Not in Lochgarroch itself. There is no memorial in Lochgarroch. There is no longer a Lochgarroch. The memorial is in a village 9 miles south, a surviving parish, a functioning church, a stone that was erected in 1921 and still stands in the churchyard today. 11 names carved into it. 11 men from a settlement that would, within 2 years of that stone being set into the ground, cease to exist in any official record of the British state. I stood at that memorial on a Tuesday morning in October. The stone was cold in the way that Scottish stone is always cold, not from the weather, but from something deeper, something the geology holds regardless of season. 11 names. And what the stone does not say, what no memorial ever says, is what happened after. 7 of those 11 men came home. I know this because the minister kept records. His name was Reverend William Aldcroft, and he was the Church of Scotland, minister for the parish that included Lochgarroch from 1911 until his retirement in 1931. He was English-born, which mattered in ways I'll come back to. He kept a private journal, not his official parish record, which was a separate and carefully maintained document, but a personal journal, written in a small brown notebook, in handwriting that a graphologist would describe as precise and controlled, until approximately the middle of 1923, after which it becomes compressed, the letters smaller, the pressure of the pen heavier, as though the writer was trying to take up less space on the page while simultaneously pressing harder into it. His daughter donated the journal to the Highland Archive Centre in Inverness in 1979. She told the archivist it was family papers, personal writings, nothing of historical significance. The archivist thanked her, logged it under Aldcroft, W. Personal correspondence and diaries, and filed it in a box with his retirement correspondence and an order of service from his final Sunday sermon. She did not read it before she donated it. She told the archivist she had never read it, that she had found it in a trunk after her father's death in 1961 and had kept it for 18 years without opening it, because something about it, she said, had always made her reluctant. Reluctant. That was the word she used. I understand why. The journal opens in 1919 with the return of the survivors. Aldcroft writes about the homecoming with the careful warmth of a minister who has been trained to find grace in difficult circumstances. He writes about the relief of the families. He writes about the services of thanksgiving he conducted, the prayers offered, the particular quality of gratitude that exists only in communities that have learned not to take survival for granted. He was a good writer, careful and observant. You get the sense of a man who genuinely loved the community he served, even if he sometimes struggled with the distance between his English upbringing and the Gaelic-speaking world he had been placed inside. The 7 men who returned are named in the journal. I will not use their full names here. Some of their descendants are still living, and the considerations around that are ones I take seriously. But I can tell you what Aldcroft observed. He writes that by the summer of 1920, something had shifted among the returning men that he could not adequately name. He tries several times. He writes that they had become watchful, his word underlined once. He writes that they attended church less regularly, and when they did attend, they sat together, always together, in the back pews, and left immediately after the service, without the customary exchange of words at the door. He writes that they had begun meeting in the evenings at a location he could not identify. He had asked and been told politely, but without room for further inquiry, that it was a private matter. He did not find this alarming at first. He had read the literature on shell shock. He had attended a conference in Inverness in 1920, specifically about the pastoral care of returning veterans. He knew that men came back changed. He knew that the change was not always visible in ways that medicine or ministry could easily reach. He extended patience. He extended grace. He waited. What he did not expect, and what began appearing in the journal from late 1920 onward, was organization. These men were not retreating from the community. They were operating within it with a deliberateness that Aldcroft found increasingly difficult to interpret as simply grief or trauma. They were meeting. They were corresponding. He noticed the increase in mail, which passed through the post office where one of the 7 worked. They were making decisions that affected the whole settlement, and presenting those decisions as accomplished facts rather than matters for community discussion. When the question of the unfulfilled land grants arose, Kicklast, the crofts they had been promised under the 1919 Act, the government's commitment to returning veterans that had not materialized into actual, workable land, it was the 7 men who organized the formal petition, who drafted the letters to the Board of Agriculture, who determined the strategy. Aldcroft writes, in the spring of 1922, that he had come to believe the 7 men of Lochgarroch had made a decision he was not privy to. He does not speculate about the nature of that decision. He is too careful for speculation. But he writes that whatever it was, it had given them a quality he had not seen in them before the war. A particular kind of stillness, he calls it. Not the stillness of men who have given up. The stillness of men who are waiting for something specific. The land petition was formally denied in March of 1923. The Board of Agriculture's response letter is in the official files. I found it, and it is exactly what you would expect from a government department that had made promises it did not intend to keep. bureaucratic, measured, regretful in tone, and constructed in such a way that it closed every avenue of formal appeal without appearing to do so. It was a document written by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Aldcroft records receiving news of the denial in his journal. He records visiting the 7 men that same week. He writes that they received the news in silence, that none of them expressed surprise, that one of them, he uses only an initial D throughout the later sections of the journal, said something in Gaelic that Aldcroft did not fully understand, but which was received by the others with the specific gravity of a thing that had already been decided. 6 weeks later, in late April of 1923, a government inspector named Alasdair Moore was dispatched from the district office to conduct a formal review of the land settlement situation in the Lochgarroch area. This was unusual. Formal reviews of this kind were typically conducted by correspondence. A physical inspection meant someone in the district office believed the situation warranted direct assessment, or had been told it did. Moore arrived in the district on the 14th of October, 1923. His departure from the district office is logged. His horse and trap were signed out. His route was recorded. He was expected to return within 3 days. He did not return in 3 days. He did not return at all. His transfer papers, filed 10 days after his departure, while he was still officially in the field, list him as reassigned to the Aberdeen District Office, effective immediately. No reason given beyond administrative necessity. No record of Muir having requested the transfer. No record of any communication from Muir after the 14th of October confirming his reassignment or acknowledging receipt of the transfer order. Alasdair Muir was transferred to Aberdeen, where, according to the Aberdeen District Office records that I requested under a Freedom of Information filing, and which took 14 months to partially declassify. Alasdair Muir never arrived. He was transferred to a city he never reached, from a village that ceased to exist, in the same month. And Reverend Aldcroft's journal, which had been running to several entries per week through the spring and summer of 1923, detailed, observant, the record of a conscientious man doing his job in a community he cared for, makes its final entry on the 9th of October, 1923. 5 days before Alasdair Moore left the district office and disappeared. The final entry is 4 words. I cannot write more. In 1924, the Scottish office received 41 letters. 41 individual letters from 41 separate individuals, written across a span of 8 months, from addresses in Rossshire, in Lewis, in Glasgow, in Inverness, and as far south as Dundee. They were written by mothers and sisters and brothers and cousins, and in 3 cases by solicitors acting on behalf of families who had grown frustrated enough with silence to pay for a professional voice. They asked, in various ways, the same question. They asked about relatives, named relatives, specifically named, who lived in or near a settlement called Lochgarroch, from whom they had received no correspondence since the autumn of 1923, and from whom, despite repeated attempts to make contact, they had heard nothing. 41 letters. 41 families reached through the administrative machinery of the British state, asking it to account for people it was supposed to know about. We know the letters existed because the replies exist. The replies are in a file at the National Records of Scotland, catalogued under Scottish Office General Correspondence. Miscellaneous Resolved, 1924. The file is accessible. It has been accessible for decades. It sits in a series of boxes that researchers working on Highland land history have passed through many times, looking for evidence of the policy disputes of the period. The letters are there, all 41 of them. And what stops you cold, what stopped me cold, on a grey Edinburgh afternoon, with the archive closing in an hour, is not their content. It is their sameness. Every reply letter says the same thing. Not approximately the same thing. Not the same thing expressed in different languages by different civil servants, drawing on the same institutional position. The same sentence, word for word, across 41 letters. Different dates spanning 8 months. Different recipient names typed at the top. Different reference numbers in the upper right corner. Different typists. You can tell by the key pressure and the slight variations in the letter alignment, the small mechanical fingerprint that every typewriter leaves. One sentence. No variation. As though someone had written it once, handed it to a succession of clerks, and instructed them to reproduce it exactly. No record of a settlement by that name exists within the applicable district. I want you to read that sentence slowly. Not no record of your relative. Now we are unable to locate the individual you have named. Not even we have no information regarding the settlement in question. Those would be evasions, recognizable, familiar evasions, the kind that administrative bodies produce naturally when they wish to avoid accountability without technically lying. This sentence is different. This sentence does not evade the question. It eliminates the premise. It does not say the settlement cannot be found. It says the settlement does not exist in any record. It is not a Makitanakyan failure of information retrieval. It is a statement about reality. It is the institutional equivalent of looking a family in the eye and saying, there was never anything there. 41 families were told, in identical language, that the place their relatives lived had never existed. I submitted the reply letters to a linguistic analyst, informally a colleague at a Scottish university who works on historical administrative language, and asked her to assess the probability that 41 separate civil servants, working across 8 months, would independently produce identical response language to a category of inquiry without being given a template. Her answer was unambiguous. The probability was, in her words, functionally 0. This was not institutional consistency. This was a script. Someone wrote it. Someone distributed it. Someone ensured it was used, and used exactly without deviation, for the entirety of 1924. That takes coordination. That takes authority. That takes someone, or a small group of someones, who had both the access and the seniority to reach across multiple desks, multiple departments, multiple months, and maintain a single controlled response to a category of inquiry that should not, by any ordinary administrative logic, have required one. Now consider the Church of Scotland. The Church of Scotland's presbytery records for the relevant synod are held at the National Records of Scotland in a separate collection from the civil administrative files. They are ecclesiastical records, a different institution, a different archive, a different filing system maintained by different people under different authority. The Civil Service and the Church of Scotland in 1923 and 1924 were not coordinating bodies. They had overlapping social relationships in rural communities, as they always had, but they were institutionally distinct. Separate chains of command, separate motivations, separate reasons to do anything. The presbytery record for the parish that included Lochgarroch shows that the Lochgarroch congregation was removed from the active register in November of 1923. The notation beside the removal reads, "Congregation absorbed, no further administration required." I read that notation many times before I accepted what I was seeing. Absorbed, present tense, passive voice, not dissolved, not relocated, not transferred to a named receiving congregation. Absorbed, the way a smaller thing is absorbed by a large thing, when the larger thing has no interest in acknowledging the transaction. And no further administration required, which in ecclesiastical record-keeping means the congregation's members are now the administrative responsibility of another body, another church, another minister, another register. Which register? The presbytery record does not say. I checked every receiving parish within a 30-mile radius. I checked their membership records for 1923 and 1924, looking for an influx of new communicants that might represent a relocated congregation. I checked the baptismal records, the confirmation records, the burial records. A community does not disappear without its members continuing to be born and confirmed and buried somewhere. I found nothing. No receiving parish absorbed a congregation from Lochgarroch. No membership rolls show the kind of sudden increase you would expect. The congregation was absorbed into an administrative silence so complete that not even the church, which had been recording the births and deaths and spiritual lives of Highland communities for 3 centuries, could account for where it went. The civil service had no record of the settlement. The church had no record of the congregation. What remained was the census. The 1921 census is public. It was released on schedule, and it is searchable, and the households of Lochgarroch are in it. Real names, real ages, real family structures, parents and children and grandparents and the occasional lodger, all enumerated by a census enumerator who walked the settlement on the appointed day in June of 1921 and wrote down what he found. They are there. They are absolutely, documentably, verifiably there in 1921. I cross-referenced those households against the 1931 census. The 1931 census for Scotland was partially destroyed during the Second World War. A documented loss, a genuine archival tragedy, and a fact that I note here, not because I believe it is relevant to what happened in Lochgarroch, but because I am aware that its absence is convenient. What survives of the 1931 census for the relevant district does not contain the households of Lochgarroch. That alone proves nothing. The destruction was real. But I also checked the 1939 National Register, the comprehensive population survey conducted at the outbreak of the Second World War, which is intact and searchable, and represents one of the most complete population records Britain ever produced. I checked the electoral rolls for every subsequent year from 1924 through 1945. I checked the National Health Service registration records from 1948, when registration became compulsory for the entire British population. The 23 children enrolled in Lochgarroch Parish School in September of 1923 were born, on average, around 1912. They would have been 27 years old at the start of the Second World War. Old enough to serve, old enough to appear in military records, in ration books, in NHS registration files, old enough to vote, old enough to marry and produce children of their own who would appear in subsequent records. I found none of them. Not one. Not under the household names from the 1921 census. Not under married names cross-referenced through the General Register Office. Not in the military service records held at the National Archives in Kew. 23 children who were present in a school register in September of 1923, and who, in every record generated by the British state after November of that year, do not exist. The 41 reply letters used the word applicable 3 times, in the phrase applicable district, which appears in each one. It is an unusual word choice for this context. The more common administrative phrasing of the period would have been relevant district or designated area. Applicable carries a specific legal connotation. It implies a determination has been made about what applies and what does not. It implies someone with the authority to make that determination has made it. I noted the word choice. I moved on. And then, 3 weeks later, reading through the Board of Agriculture's internal correspondence from 1923, I found it again. In a memo dated the 3rd of November, 1923, 5 weeks after Alastair Muir left the district office and never reached Aberdeen, an unnamed senior official writes to an unnamed recipient about the finalization of certain land settlement matters in Ross Shire. The memo is 2 paragraphs long. The second paragraph reads in its entirety: "The applicable district has been resolved. No further correspondence should be generated or retained on this matter. No further correspondence should be generated or retained." Someone did not merely decide to stop talking about Lochgarroch. Someone instructed others to stop, and instructed them with the particular precision of a person who understood the difference between silence and erasure, not merely to generate no new correspondence, but to retain none that already existed. The 41 reply letters survived because they were sent, because they left the building, because once a letter reaches the person it was addressed to, it is beyond the reach of the instruction not to retain it. The 41 families kept what they received. And what they received, in identical language, across 8 months, tells us everything about the coordination behind it, and nothing, still nothing, about what it was coordinating to conceal. Someone organized this silence, and organized silence always has an author. In 1987, a woman named Margaret Craich walked into the Inverness Museum and Art Gallery carrying a cardboard box. She was 73 years old. She had driven from Dingwall, where she had lived her entire life, in a car her son had lent her for the occasion because she did not, at 73, trust herself on the longer roads anymore. She told the archivist on duty that the box contained photographs belonging to her grandfather. Donald Craich, the postal inspector whose route logs we have already spent time with, whose last entry before his transfer named 47 households and noted all deliveries accepted. She said the photographs were from his working years. Rural communities, roads and landscapes. Nothing special, she said. Nothing anyone would particularly want. But she was getting older. Her children had no interest in old photographs, and it seemed wrong to throw them away. The archivist thanked her, logged the donation, catalogued the box as Rural Highland, Communities Photographic Collection, circa 1920 to 1925. Donor, Crich, M. Placed it in the appropriate storage area, noted it in the accessions register with the standard notation indicating the collection had not yet been individually catalogued. The box sat for 31 years. In 2018, a postgraduate researcher named Fiona Drummond was working on her doctoral thesis, a study of photographic documentation of Highland rural life in the interwar period. She had requested access to several uncatalogued collections at the museum as part of her primary source research. The Crich box was on her list because the date range matched her study period, and because, as she told me when I contacted her, she had learned early in her research that the most interesting material was almost always in the boxes nobody had properly catalogued yet, the ones that arrived with a brief description and then sat in the dark for decades, waiting for someone to ask the right question. She opened the box on a Wednesday afternoon in March. The first layer of photographs was exactly what Margaret Crich had described. Roads, landscapes, stone walls running across hillsides, a river in what appeared to be early spring, a farmstead photographed from a distance, the kind of image a man might take because he passed it every week. And one morning the light was right, and he had his camera with him. Competent, unhurried photographs, the record of a man who looked carefully at the world he moved through. Then, beneath those, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had been folded with deliberate care, the kind of care you take with something you intend to preserve, were the portraits. 31 of them. Fiona Drummond told me that she sat with them for a long time before she did anything else, before she called anyone over, before she reached for her cataloguing notebook, before she did any of the professional things a doctoral researcher is trained to do when they encounter significant material. She sat with them because something about them demanded it, because 31 people were looking directly at her across 95 years, and the looking required acknowledgement before it required analysis. I understand that response. I felt something similar when she sent me the digitized copies months later, after we had established contact through the museum's research inquiry system. You open the file expecting historical photographs. You find faces. They were taken by someone who knew what they were doing. The composition is deliberate, the subjects positioned with care, the light managed with the patience of a photographer who understood that rural light in the Scottish Highlands in the early 1920s was not something you commanded. It was something you waited for, and then used quickly when it came. Men and women and children, mostly in their working clothes, some in what appears to be Sunday dress, individual portraits and small groups, a woman with 2 children, one on each side, her hands resting on their shoulders, with the particular combination of firmness and tenderness that a certain kind of parent has. an older man seated on a low stone wall, looking not at the camera, but slightly past it, at something the frame does not include. No names, no locations noted on the reverse, no dates, just the images themselves, wrapped in oilcloth and placed beneath the innocuous landscapes by a man who, for reasons we can only now speculate about, chose to preserve them separately from his official photographic record, to carry them, wrapped and protected, into a retirement he had not chosen, and to keep them until he died. Donald Craich died in 1951. The photographs remained in family possession for 36 years after his death, before his granddaughter carried them to Inverness in a cardboard box and described them as nothing special. She did not know what she was carrying. I'm certain of that. Margaret Craich was not concealing anything. She was simply a woman in her 70s, doing the responsible thing with a dead man's belongings, too close to her own mortality to let things accumulate unaddressed. She had no idea that the oilcloth package beneath the landscapes contained the only known visual record of people that the British state had spent 50 years pretending had never existed. Now let me tell you about one photograph in particular. It is the 14th image in Fiona Drummond's digitized sequence. A woman, photographed alone, standing in front of a building. She appears to be in her late 30s or early 40s, though the light and the photographic quality of the period make precise estimation difficult. She is dressed practically. A dark wool jacket, her hair pinned back in the manner common to working women of the early 1920s. She is looking directly at the camera with an expression that I have spent considerable time trying to describe accurately, and have consistently failed to reduce to a single word. It is not defiance, exactly. It is not a resignation. It is something that sits precisely between those two things, in the specific emotional territory occupied by people who have understood something clearly and are deciding, in real time, what to do with that understanding. Behind her, partially visible, is the building she stands in front of. Stone construction, as almost everything in that landscape was. A doorway to her left. And above the doorway, carved into the lintel stone, partially obscured by the angle of the photograph, partially by what appears to be lichen growth, the beginning of a date. The numerals 189, and then the stone curves out of frame. The last digit, and whatever followed it, is lost to the angle of Donald Craich's camera on whatever morning he stood in front of that building and asked this woman to hold still for a moment. 189. A building constructed sometime in the 1890s, in a settlement that the 1931 Ordnance Survey map recorded and the 1933 map erased. Fiona Drummond spent 8 months attempting to identify the subjects of the 31 portraits through conventional archival methods. She cross-referenced physical descriptions against census records. She consulted with specialists in Highland photographic history. She submitted the collection to the Scots Family History Society and requested assistance from genealogical researchers with expertise in Ross-shire lineages. The museum made the digitized images available on their online catalogue, accompanied by a public appeal for identification assistance that generated significant response. Hundreds of people contacted the museum, certain they recognized a grandparent, or a great-aunt, or a face from another family photograph. Not one identification was confirmed. Every lead dissolved on closer examination. Every near match turned out to be someone from somewhere else, in some other decade, captured by some other camera. 31 faces. 0 confirmed identities. In a country where genealogical records are among the most comprehensive in the world, where family history research is a national preoccupation, where the appetite for recovering Highland ancestry is deep and genuine and extensively resourced. 0. Then I found Katrina Macaulay. She was 91 years old when a community oral history project recorded her testimony in 2019 in her home in Lewis. The project was focused on 20th century island life, and the interviewer had asked her about her mother's family and their experience of the land question in the years after the First World War. Katrina Macaulay's mother had been born on the mainland, in Ross Shire, before the family moved to Lewis in the mid-1920s. Katrina could not have been more than 6 or 7 when they moved, and her memories of the mainland were fragmentary. The smell of a particular kind of peat, a road that ran alongside water, a school she had briefly attended before they left. And then, unprompted, in the armstem middle of discussing something else entirely, she said this. She said her mother had a cousin who went to the mainland and never came back, that the family had waited for letters and no letters had come. When her mother asked about the cousin, her grandmother had told her, once, not to ask again. Not harshly, not with anger. With the specific quality of warning that exists in communities that have learned the cost of asking certain questions aloud. Her grandmother had said, and Katrina Macaulay at 91 could still produce the Gaelic phrase from somewhere beneath 50 years of disuse. Something that translated, approximately, as some doors, once closed, are closed for everyone. Her mother's maiden name was one of the names in the Lochgarroch section of the 1921 census. I am not stating that as a conclusion. I am stating it as a fact that exists alongside other facts, in the same way that all the facts in this story exist, separately, individually defensible, and collectively pointing in a direction that the official record has spent a century insisting there is nothing to point toward. Fiona Drummond, in the final section of her doctoral thesis, included a footnote. A footnote, not the main text, a footnote, noting that one of the 31 portrait subjects bore a strong physical resemblance to a woman photographed at a land rights rally in Dingwall in 1919. The Dingwall photograph was published in the Rossshire Journal on the 14th of March, 1919, and exists in the newspaper's archived editions held at the Highland Archive Centre. The woman in that photograph is identifiable by the caption. Her name is printed beneath the image, one of 6 rally participants named by the journalist who covered the event. In the 1919 photograph, taken at a rally where veterans and their families were demanding the land they had been promised, she is standing at the front of the assembled crowd, looking at the camera, with the expression of someone who believes completely that they are going to win. In the portrait from the oilcloth package, taken sometime between 1920 and 1923, in front of a building in a place that no longer exists, she is looking at the camera with something else entirely. I have spent a long time with both photographs. She had learned, somewhere in the years between 1919 and that morning in front of the stone building, what the closed door felt like from the inside. In 2021, I submitted a Freedom of Information request to the Scottish Government. I had done this before, in the course of this research. FOI requests are the unglamorous infrastructure of historical investigation, the long, bureaucratic, frequently disappointing mechanism by which a private citizen asks a government to account for itself. Most requests return either nothing of significance or a politely formatted confirmation that nothing of significance exists. You develop a relationship with the process that is less like hope and more like the particular stubbornness of someone who has decided that the asking matters even when the answer is no. This request was specific. I asked for all Board of Agriculture files relating to land settlement disputes and administrative reviews in Ross-shire between 1919 and 1925. I knew some of those files existed. I had found references to them in the correspondence I had already accessed. The kind of internal mentions that appear when one document gestures toward another. When a memo says, "See attached," and the attachment is no longer attached. When a letter refers to a report that does not appear in any catalogue. The shadows of documents. The outlines of things that were there and are no longer where they should be. The response arrived 11 weeks later. 43 files in the relevant category had been reviewed for release. 31 were released in full. 8 were released in redacted form. Pages intact, but with sections obscured, names removed, specific locations replaced with bracketed notations reading "place name redacted," or personal details withheld. The redacted files told a fragmented story. Enough to confirm that the land dispute process in Ross-shire in the early 1920s was more contested, more actively managed, and more deliberately suppressed in the official record than anything I had previously been able to document. And 4 files were withheld entirely. Not redacted, not partially released, withheld under Section 41 of the Freedom of Information, Scotland, Act 2002, the exemption that applies, in the precise language of the legislation, when disclosure would constitute an actionable breach of confidence. Section 41. Actionable breach of confidence. For files generated in 1923. I want to be exact about what this means, because it is easy to hear legal exemption and understand it as bureaucratic caution, the institutional reflex of governments that have learned to be careful with old wounds. That interpretation would be generous. Section 41 is not a precautionary exemption. It is not applied to material that is merely sensitive or embarrassing or politically inconvenient. It applies when releasing information would expose the releasing party to legal action. When someone, some individual, some institution, some legal entity still operating in the present tense, retains a confidence that they have the legal standing to protect. Someone is still keeping a confidence about what happened in Lochgarroch in 1923. And someone, in 2021, still considers it actionable to break it. I appealed the decision. The appeal process under Scottish FOI legislation is handled by the Scottish Information Commissioner, an independent office, genuinely independent, staffed by people who take the public interest seriously and who have, in numerous cases, overturned governmental decisions to withhold. I filed my appeal with a supporting argument that ran to 14 pages and which cited precedents from the Commissioner's own published decisions. I believed, and still believe, that the argument was sound. I waited 7 months for the Commissioner's ruling. The ruling upheld the Scottish Government's decision to withhold. The Commissioner's written decision, which is a public document, and which I have read with the attention it deserves, does not explain why the confidence is still considered actionable. It confirms that the exemption was correctly applied. It confirms that the public interest test was conducted. It concludes that in this instance, the public interest in maintaining the exemption outweighs the public interest in disclosure. The public interest in maintaining the exemption. For files from 1923, about a village that the official record says never existed. I have tried to imagine what is in those 4 files that rises to that standard. I have constructed and discarded numerous possibilities. The one I return to most consistently is the simplest one, and it is this. The files contain names, not the names of the people of Lochgarroch. Those names are already knowable, through the census, through the school register, through Donald Crike's route logs. The names in those files are different names. Names of people who were not from Lochgarroch. Names of people who made decisions, wrote memos, signed transfer orders, typed 41 identical reply letters, and ensured that a community's existence was methodically and completely removed from every official record of the British state over the course of a single autumn. Names that belong to families. Families that may still have members living. Members who retain, in the eyes of Scottish law, a confidence that predates their birth, and that someone, somewhere, has maintained the institutional standing to protect across 100 years and 4 governmental administrations. That is what Section 41 protects. Not secrets, confidence. The difference is significant. A secret can be kept by one person choosing silence. A confidence is a legal relationship. It requires parties. It requires an original agreement, explicit or implied, between someone who disclosed something and someone who received that disclosure under an obligation of non-disclosure. A confidence that is still actionable in 2021 is a confidence that was structured from the beginning to survive. Whoever organized the silence in 1923 organized it to last. Now I want to return to Donald Crike one final time. His route logs run to several hundred pages across his years of service. I have read all of them. They are, for the most part, exactly what they appear to be. The meticulous daily record of a conscientious man doing a practical job in a demanding landscape. But there is a quality to the Lochgarroch entries, across the 4 years they appear, that is different from the rest of the log. A quality I noticed only after I had read enough of the surrounding entries to understand his baseline rhythm, his habitual level of detail, the things he consistently noted, and the things he consistently omitted. The Lochgarroch entries are warmer. Not dramatically, not in a way that announces itself, but they are there longer in the log than the distance and delivery count would strictly require. He notes things he does not note elsewhere: the state of a particular garden, the progress of a building repair, once, the fact that a woman he does not named by anything other than the Macaulay household had left a piece of shortbread on the gate post for the postman, which he found when he arrived, and which he records with the specific notational care of a man who was moved by the gesture and wanted the record to hold it. Shortbread on a gatepost. On an October morning in 1922. 1 year before everything ended. The final entry is dated the 27th of September, 1923. 17 days before Alasdair Muir left the district office and did not reach Aberdeen. 2 months before Donald Crich was transferred to a district he had not requested and had no apparent reason to want. The entry reads, as we have established, with professional completeness. 47 delivery points. Post office operational. All deliveries accepted. And then, beneath the official notation, in handwriting slightly smaller than his usual hand, the kind of smaller handwriting that the minister's journal also developed in its final months, I notice, though I do not know what to make of that, he wrote 4 additional words that are not part of any standard root log format. 4 words that appear nowhere else in his years of meticulous documentation. 4 words that the Highland Archive Centre's cataloguing notes describe, in the finding aid, as personal notation. Significance unclear. Good people. God help. 4 words. A postal inspector who believed in the completeness of the record, who noted shortbread on gateposts because the record should reflect reality exactly, who drove that road every week for 4 years and watched 47 households go about the work of being alive in a difficult landscape. That man, on his last visit, pressed his pen slightly harder into the page and wrote 4 words that were not part of his job. Good people. God help. He knew. By the 27th of September, 1923, Donald Crich knew something was coming that he could not stop, and could not report, and could not do anything about except drive his route one final time and note, for a record he must have understood would eventually be read by someone, that the people he had been delivering to for 4 years were good, that they deserved whatever help existed to give. He wrapped their photographs in an oilcloth. He carried them home. He kept them until he died. And his granddaughter, who did not know what she was carrying, drove them to Inverness in a cardboard box in 1987 and described them as nothing special. They are everything special. They are the only evidence that these people had faces. The road is still there. I looked at it on a satellite mapping service on a Tuesday evening, sitting at a desk in an ordinary room in an ordinary city. And there it is. A farm track now, overgrown at the edges, the surface reduced over a century of disuse to something that is more suggestion than road. It runs north from the junction where the 1931 map marks its beginning. It crosses a stretch of open ground. It climbs slightly toward a hillside. And on that hillside, visible in the satellite image if you zoom to the highest resolution and look carefully at the way the grass lies, visible in the way that things are only visible when the light comes in low and oblique, when the shadows do what the records will not. There are rectangular depressions in the ground, the subsided outlines of foundations, stone that was once the base of walls, now beneath the turf, still holding the shape of the rooms that stood above them. 47 households, or the ghostly geometry of what 47 households leave behind when a century of weather works at them from above, while the ground holds them from below. The shapes are still there, They will be there long after the files are opened or destroyed or simply outlasted by time. The ground remembers what the paper was instructed to forget. I do not know what happened in Lochgarroch in the autumn of 1923. I have spent considerable time with the evidence, and I have constructed possibilities, and I have tested them against what the record contains and what the record refuses to contain. And I have arrived, after all of that, at the same place I was before I started, which is not ignorance exactly, but something more specific than ignorance. I know the shape of what happened. I know its administrative outline, its bureaucratic skeleton, the procedural bones of it. I know how it was hidden, and by what means, and with what degree of coordination, and over what sustained period of institutional effort. What I do not know, what the 4 withheld files may or may not contain, what Section 41 of the Freedom of Information, Scotland Act, is still, tonight, protecting someone from having to answer for, is the human interior of it. The room where the decision was made. The name of the person who wrote the template that 41 clerks reproduced without variation across 8 months of 1924. The reason that a government inspector left for Lochgarroch on the 14th of October and was recorded as transferred to a city he never reached. The reason that a minister stopped writing on the 9th of October, 5 days before the inspector left. What Reverend Aldcroft saw in those 5 days reduced a man who had written careful, observant, theologically considered journal entries several times a week for 12 years to 4 words. I cannot write more. 47 households, 23 children, 11 names on a memorial 9 miles south. A postal inspector transferred to nowhere. A minister whose handwriting got smaller as the year went on. A woman at a land rally who stopped believing she was going to win. 31 faces in a box that sat in a museum for 31 years, waiting for someone to open it. 91-year-old Catriona McAuley in Lewis, pulling a Gaelic phrase from beneath 50 years of disuse. Some doors, once closed, are closed for everyone. And not knowing, as she said it, that she was describing the door her grandmother had already been standing behind for decades. 4 files, still sealed, still considered by someone with the legal standing to hold that position, too sensitive to open. They were worth remembering. Every single one of them was worth remembering. The woman with her hands on her children's shoulders? The older man looked at something outside the frame. The 23 children whose names are in a school register and nowhere else. The 7 men who came home from a war and organized themselves around a grievance that was real and documented and formally denied in March of 1923, and never officially addressed again. They were worth the shortbread on the gatepost, worth the oilcloth, worth the 4 words pressed into the page by a man who understood that the record should reflect reality exactly, and who could not, in the end, let the record reflect nothing at all. The road is still there. It ends at a hillside that the maps say is empty. It is not empty. The foundations are there. The shapes are in the ground. And somewhere in a filing system that was built, with considerable expertise and sustained institutional will, to outlast every person who might have reason to open it. There are names, not the names carved on the memorial 9 miles south. Different names. Names that someone, in the present tense, still has legal standing to protect. I have submitted a second FOI request. It is currently under review. I expect it will take 11 weeks to receive a response. I expect the response will be measured and courteous, and will tell me, in language carefully chosen, to close every avenue of further inquiry without appearing to do so, that certain things remain outside the boundaries of what I am permitted to know. I will appeal it. Because Donald Crich noted the shortbread on the gate post, because the record should reflect reality exactly. Because because the teachers who understood what the record was for knew that its function was not to protect the comfortable, but to hold the truth in trust for the people who came after. Because Reverend Aldcroft wrote everything down until the morning he could not, and in writing everything down, he left us the shape of what he could not say. Because Margaret Crich drove to Inverness in a borrowed car and handed over a box she did not know contained faces, and in doing so handed over the only evidence that those faces existed. Because Katrina McAuley, at 91, remembered the Gaelic phrase her grandmother said once, and never repeated. And in remembering it, she gave us the last living echo of a woman who had known the cost of asking the wrong questions, and had paid it, and had tried, in the only way still available to her, to protect her family from paying it too. Some doors, once closed, are closed for everyone. Not this one. The road is still there. It ends at a hillside. The foundations are in the ground. The photographs are in a museum in Inverness. 31 faces, catalogued now, digitized, visible to anyone who requests access to the Crich collection. Go look at them. Look at the 14th image. Look at what is in her expression, that specific place between defiance and resignation, between the person who believed they were going to win and the person who learned what it cost to lose. Look at her for long enough that she becomes real to you, because she was real, because they all were, because the entire and elaborate machinery of institutional silence that was constructed around them and maintained across a century was built precisely to prevent you from understanding that. It did not entirely work. You know their shape now. You know the outline of what was taken. You know that someone, tonight, still holds the confidence of what happened in the autumn of 1923 in a village on a hillside in Rossshire, and considers it still actionable to speak. That is not the end of the story. That is the story waiting to be finished by whoever is willing to open the right door